Hello everyone, this is Dr. Loshik, and in this lecture we're going to talk about the construct validity of behavioral observations. Last chapter we talked about different ways in which we might measure variables. One way was self-report, the second way was observational research, and the third way was physiological research. So now we're going to talk about the construct validity of observational research. Observational research is when researchers watch and systematically record behaviors from animals or humans. Sometimes using an observational method over a self-report method is the preferred way to get away from the problems that are inherent with the self-report method. However, we must know that observational methods also have issues that we're going to discuss in this lecture. If you recall, observational methods are just one of the three different ways to operationalize a concept, again, them being self-report, observational research, or physiological research. So when assessing construct validity, we are asking ourselves whether or not how we are measuring is truly measuring the construct of interest. So for assessing the construct validity of observational methods, we are asking ourselves if the observations we are recording are truly measuring the concept of interest. There are three problems with observational research. Number one is observer bias, two is observer effects, and three is reactivity. So even though the observational method takes care of a lot of the issues that are involved with the self-report method, it has a lot of issues of its own, and the remainder of this lecture we're going to talk about those issues. Again, the three issues are observer bias, observer effects, and reactivity. Let's talk about the first one, observer bias. Observer bias is when the observer's expectations or hypotheses actually change their interpretation of the behaviors that they are viewing. A great example of this phenomenon is in an experiment where they had two groups of participants who were told they were going to observe a videotape of a man giving a little talk. One half of the participants were told that they were going to be viewing a tape of a male job applicant. The second group was told that they would be viewing a tape of a male psychiatric patient. What both groups didn't know is that they were viewing the exact same tape. Because of their expectations about the differences between job applicants versus psychiatric patients, both groups had vastly different interpretations of the man's behavior. The group that thought they were viewing a job applicant described his behaviors as innovative and attractive, while the group that was told they were viewing a psychiatric patient viewed his behavior as tight, defensive, and aggressive. This is a great example of observer bias because the expectations and beliefs of the observers changed how they interpreted the same information. The second issue of observational research is observer effects. Observer effects is when the observer's behaviors change the participant's behavior based on what condition they are in. This is also known as expectancy effects. In other words, the researcher or the observer is causing the behavior of the participants to conform to their expectations in measurable ways. There are several studies that tested this phenomenon and have demonstrated it. One such was conducted in a classroom. Half of the students were given rats and were told that their rats were maze bright, meaning that if they tried to teach that rat to run through a maze, they would learn very quickly. The other half of the students were told that they were receiving maze dull rats, meaning that if they tried to teach their rat to run through a maze, it would take them a very long time to learn, if they would learn at all. What the students didn't know is that all of the rats were exactly the same, and there was no original difference between the rat's ability to learn the maze. However, after some training with the rats, the only rats that learned how to run through the maze were the maze bright rats, because the behavior of the observers, or the students in this case, and their expectations of the rats' behavior actually changed the rats' behavior. So there must have been subtle differences in the behavior between the maze bright group and the maze dull group of the observers to change the rats' behaviors. Another good example of this is the report of a horse owner from a long time ago. This horse owner said that he had taught his horse arithmetic, and nobody believed him, so a lot of tests ensued to see if he was telling the truth. When the horse was asked to add numbers, the horse would tap the right answer with his hoof. And any scientist who came to study the horse's behavior could not identify any tricks that were being pulled, any secrets, anything that might suggest that this horse did not know math. So for a long time, they believed that the horse did, in fact, know math. However, later they found out that the horse was actually just picking up on subtle clues that the researcher's behavior to drive when he stopped tapping his hoof. What they figured out is that the horse was picking up on the breathing rate and the excitement and the expectations of the researchers watching him. And when a certain elevation of breathing rate and heart rate and whatever else the horse could pick up on happened, he stopped tapping his foot and was rewarded for it. So when they finally figured out that this was happening, they did a blind study. So they had it where a researcher would whisper the math equation into the horse's ear, and then the observers, who were counting how many times the horse tapped his foot, were unaware of the question that was asked. So they couldn't subtly influence when the horse would stop tapping his hoof. And because of that, the horse never was able to figure out when to stop tapping, and he would continue tapping, hoping that he would get a clue as to when to stop. So again, they found out that the horse did not know math, but instead was reacting to the researchers' expectations. The horse actually changed its behaviors to conform to the researchers' motivations. So with observer bias, the one we talked about first, it is when the behavior of the participant has not changed at all, but the interpretation of that information changes based off of the observer's expectations. But with observer effects, the participant's behavior is actually changing due to the observer's motivations and expectations. So there are several ways to try and prevent observer bias and observer effects. The first way is to train the observers very carefully. Most researchers, if they're doing observational research and working with several observers, they create code books with explicit instructions on what to look for to reduce these types of biases. Another way is to have multiple observers observe the same behavior at the same time and then compare their observations. This is also known as increasing inter-rater reliability, right? However, the problem with doing that, having more people, more observers rate at the same time, it doesn't really solve the problem if all of the observers present have the same biases toward the situation. And if you think back, it kind of makes sense. That's why everybody in the study who viewed the video of the man, either it was a job applicant or as a psychiatric patient, all carried the same biases towards psychiatric patients and job applicants. And so all of their observations and opinions and interpretations were equally biased. And so even though there was high inter-rater reliability, it doesn't mean that their interpretations were valid. Another way that really solves the problem of observer effects is using a masked design. And this is also known as a blind design. If the researcher doesn't know the condition that they are observing, they are less likely to accidentally influence the results. For example, they figured that out in the horse study, right? So when the researchers did not know the horse's given question, they could not accidentally influence the horse to stop tapping his hoof. The third and final way that observational research is flawed is through reactivity. And reactivity is when people change their behavior because they know that someone's watching them. And this might result in those people or animals acting in their best behavior, acting in their worst behavior, or simply acting different than they would naturally in the same circumstances. Let's say we're researchers and we want to study the behavior of first graders. So we go walk into the classroom and we sit in the back of the room. Suddenly, when we're about to start recording the first graders' behavior, all of the first graders turn around in their chairs and stare at you as you sit there. This is not normal behavior, and if you started writing down in your notebook that this is what those children do, it would be inaccurate of their natural behavior if you were not there. And so sometimes that would be a good example of reactivity with those students. They're doing something completely abnormal that they wouldn't do if you hadn't been sitting there. There are three solutions or ways to solve the problem of reactivity. And the first one is to blend in. Blending in involves making yourself as unobtrusive as possible and making your observations without the participants knowing that you're doing so. And so one way to do this, if you were studying first graders, is to hide behind a one-way mirror. They'll never even be aware that their behaviors are being recorded in the first place, and so they're going to be acting naturally because of that. Another way to do it, if you weren't, for example, studying first graders, would be to blend into the crowd and not to inform the people that you're watching that you're actually watching them. For example, if you go to a mall and you're interested in mall goers' behavior, you could sit on a bench with a notebook and act like you're writing in a journal, even if you are recording the people's behavior that walk by. The second solution is to wait it out. So maybe there's no way to blend in, like with the first graders. You couldn't just sit there in the classroom and expect them to accept you as one of their own. Or you could wait there and eventually they might get used to your presence and start acting naturally again. That might be a way to wait it out. So maybe there's no way you can install a one-way mirror in that classroom, and so if you just sit in the back of the room long enough for enough weeks at a time, eventually the students won't care that you're there again. Jane Goodall did this when she was studying chimpanzees. She would wait out in the jungle, and at first the chimpanzees behaved very strangely with her for several months until finally they started to accept her as one of their own, or at least a consistent fixture in their environment that they weren't worried about anymore. The third solution is to avoid the direct behavior altogether and instead measure the traces of the behavior. And so, in other words, measuring the things the original behavior of interest has actually left behind in its wake. I gave an example of this in a previous lecture. If we're interested in measuring anxiety, for instance, and we believe that the number of bite marks on a pencil actually demonstrates a person's anxiety, we could pick up that pencil a year later and determine how much anxiety that person had a year prior. A better example of measuring traces of behavior, though, is maybe counting the number of beer bottles in a garbage can to measure the liquor consumption in a specific neighborhood. Another good example might be measuring the wear and tear on the floor of a museum to see which of the exhibits is considered most popular. All right, so there are several ethics or ethical concerns when conducting observational research. As you might probably, especially if you're measuring behavior without people's awareness, you can see that it might start to toe the line of ethical or unethical. So if it's done right, it's considered ethical. One thing that you must do to be considered ethical is if the behaviors are performed in a public place, it's considered public knowledge, and you are allowed to record that behavior. And as long as the identities of the participants remain anonymous, even to the researchers, it is considered okay. However, it becomes unethical if you are measuring the behaviors of someone in a private setting without their permission. Or if you are using video cameras to record their behavior, whether or not it's in a public setting. If you must use a video camera, and you must do so without permission so that you don't invalidate the integrity of the naturalistic behavior, then you must then, after they've performed whatever behaviors they've performed, you must then approach them, ask them if the videotape of them can be used for an experiment, and if they say no, then the researchers must delete the tape without ever even viewing it. All right, if you have any questions about any of this information, please don't hesitate to email me.